Mānawa mai e a te putanga o Matariki. Mānawa mai e a te ariki nui o te rangi. Mānawa mai e a te mātahi o te tau. Nau mai, toma mai, ki tēnei whare kōrero, e kia nei, Concept of Matariki. A kāti, tēnā, kia rukutia tā tātou kaupapa, kia ruiruia o tātou whakaaro, ki ngā pūkenga, ki ngā wānanga, ki ngā purapura o Matariki. Matariki tērā e ārau mai ana i te pai, te whetū tapu o te tau. Ko Waitā kei runga, ko Diana, Kopua, tēnei, e tau nei. Nau mai ki tā tātou kaupapa, a seeds of Matariki. Whaia, tēnā koe,
Kia ora.
kei te pēha.
Oh, pai. Yeah, tēnō pai.
Tuatahi ake, whakamōhio mai ki te hunga. Ko wai koe nohe a koe.
Tēnā tātou, he uri tēnei no te tairāwhiti whānui, he kuangi maunga, waia puawa, ko Ngāti Porou te iwi, no tikitiki, no rangitukia, no te araroa, kawa mai tawhiti. He rangihuna tēnei, engari i tipu ake au i Porirua, i raro i te maru o Ngāti Toa. He mihi kā tika, kia mihi atu kia rātou, nā rātou i poi tēnei. Ko tiro, ko Aotearoa, ko Dr. Diana Kopua, e mihi kawana ki a koutou.
Dr. Diana. When you hear doctor, you can already hear, or you're aware of the story that someone has to have in order to get that title or that in front of the ingoa. And so when you hear that, Dr. Diana, what comes to mind for you?
You know, just as you were speaking, I whakaroa mō tētahi wahine, Maria Campbell. She was Michael Campbell's mother, the famous Michael Campbell, the golfer. I didn't know he was a golfer. He was a softballer. We went to school together at Mana College. His mum was a nurse, and so I was one of the junior nurses under her. And when I decided to go to med school, she always reminded me of how I hated doctors. It's the first thought that came to my mind.
How you hated doctors.
Yeah, it wasn't the people. It was the behaviour, the hierarchy inside the health system. I learned it really fast. The arrogance. And I'm not saying that the individual doctors were like that, but there was the ability to behave like that and get away with it. So when this junior nurse would walk past a doctor and say hello, they wouldn't have to even acknowledge you, you know? There's that sort of behaviour, and I did hate that behaviour.
And so how did that then change? Going from I hate that behaviour because of the people who are doctors. When did that change for you to be like, maybe I need to be in that space, or man, I'm actually passionate about health. This is the pathway that's for me.
I think as I became more confident in myself and what I was doing, and trusted that what I was doing was making a difference, and it was very much about this kaupapa mahi atua that we grew back then. I knew it was working, and I also knew that there were some doctors who were training to be psychiatrists, to be specialists, who were loving what we were offering too. And I think it was then, it was like this moment. It didn't feel planned. I do think that there was a lot of planning, spiritual planning, and other types of planning, but I didn't see it. I just thought, I could do that. Maybe I should do that. Yeah, I'm going to do that. I had no idea what it would take. I didn't look at the curriculum. I didn't know that I had to pass chemistry in 6 months when I get to med school. I didn't know that you had to do health sciences first, that you weren't in med school unless you got a certain average. I knew nothing about that stuff. I just knew that I needed to gain as much mana, and I'm talking about mana within the health system, the hierarchical mana, that I needed as much as them in order to grow mahi atua. That's what I knew. That's nothing else. It was a bit like, because I was a teen mum, it's a bit the same. I was so excited to be pregnant, but no idea.
What was installed?
Yeah, that. But I reckon if we knew, we might not have as many babies yet. We just got the statistics in, eh? It's like, yeah, Māori.
we just sort of contributed to that yesterday.
That's right.
But let's hang around this confidence thing, because a confident person and someone who doesn't have confidence, there's a difference. You may not see it physically, but in terms of their wairua, their āhua, you can feel it. And for you, did you know that you were lacking confidence? And what did it take for you to sort of feel like, oh, actually, I'm getting familiar with who I am. I now have clear whakaaro around what I want to do. And there's more confidence than there is fear or anxiousness.
I'm thinking about relationships. And it would be relationships that help me feel more or less confident. So in my intimate relationships with men, the lacking in confidence that I could maintain a relationship, the confidence in knowing what to say, what to do, when to move forward, when to move aside, when to let go, when to hold on. All of those things were things that I'm looking retrospectively, right? Not in there, but relationships with my brothers, with my mother, with my father, with my Pākehā whānau, with my Māori whānau, all of those, my friendships, the girlfriends, workmates. And I think because I went into the health system so young that I was already set up for a lot of challenging relationships because I was in there as a Māori nurse in a mātauranga Māori space, a Māori mental health service. And although we didn't really have the language to talk about racism, we knew that what we were experiencing
was that.
Yeah. And so I built confidence because I knew when, say, a Pākehā nurse was saying that they should decide, the Pākehā or the crisis team should decide whether a Māori whānau should come into Māori mental health. I was very confident, without any data, just confident that Māori whānau were unlikely to really have choice if a Pākehā who didn't believe in a Māori mental health service was offering that choice. And so confidence grew from these beliefs that were innate almost. Yeah.
Is that similar to how you were sort of speaking about spiritual connection? Like there were spiritual things happening that you weren't aware of, but you were in harmony with.
Yeah.
Is that sort of the same kind of...
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
How can one connect more to that?
Gee, you brought the tears out fast. My grandmother, my dad's mum, Ani Kānara is her name, and Ani Kānara, Nanny Annie. She wanted to be a doctor, but her mum, my nanny Matiroa, she told my Nanny Annie that it wasn't wahine mahi. And so my Nanny Annie became a nurse. I didn't know that until I went to apply for med school. Yeah, and I remember my dad. It was my dad that told me that story. And so I thought, wow, this is that. But I also, Mark and I, my husband and I were just talking about the concept of Wairua and thinking about water and thinking about mahi atua and thinking about the blueprint of the stories, the pūrākau o rokohanga, and the lessons that are reflected in my story. And so ngā wairua looking back at each other, them looking at me and me looking at them, their past story and my past story, merging together in the now to forge the future. Wairua. And I used to talk about tohu, he tohu tēnā, he tohu pai tērā. And I'm very aware that, you know, if you search for something, you'll find it. You'll find something likened to what you're after, whether it be negative, positive, or neutral. Nonetheless, I used to always talk about tohu. And yeah, so that spirit. I was really scared about going into med school. I remember my poroporo ake at Te Whare Māori Mental Health. And I said to a Pākehā senior nurse, I said, I'm really scared about losing my spirit. And she laughed at me and said, there's no way, Di, you'll lose your spirit. And that was that ability to be with people. And so in terms of the spiritual aligning and positioning me and my thoughts and my actions to go to the South Island to do med school, it was also the interactions with whānau that I was working with, and that hononga and the love of being with and serving those people. And man, and I'm crying because they weren't nice experiences. They weren't nice. And that's why we were doing what we were doing, to improve their experience, and to think that that we could do that was a wonderful thing. And it was all driven by, for me, it was all driven by Wairua, but I think of Wairua in quite a practical way. And that's why I love Mahi Atua, because the pūrākau offer so many gems to reflect and broaden my own perspective about my way of thinking.
Oh, thank you so much. And I acknowledge the tears, and I acknowledge the space and time that you went to be able to step into the experiences that have brought the kōrero that you've generously shared with us here. And I think when we hang around in the space of pūrākau and Mahi Atua, it's not just pages on a book, or it's not just things that you hear. It's almost like a mirror. It's almost like haha tēnei, because even in a Pākehā setting, we can look at the Disney stories or whatever it may be. But when you're watching it as a kid, you're just saying, this is awesome. But then you go back and watch it as an adult, you're like, whoa, that's a mean message that you don't see as a young person. But is this sort of the kind of thing that Mahi Atua is and pūrākau is?
Yeah, absolutely. Mahi Atua is about a way of being. It's that. It's a way of being that forges us to whakamāori te ao, tō tātou nei ao, mai ngā whakaaro tai atu ki te mahi, tō mahi. And we do that by sharing pūrākau. And māma noi ho mō ngā pēpi, because they just layer it over time. They don't have to overthink it. It's not a lesson. It's not an educational lesson.
It's not finding the deeper meanings to things.
No. But sometimes that can, well, actually, let me stay with Mahi Atua. I'll go on one of my tangents again. But it's not just about the pūrākau. It's about extending our way of thinking. And the only way we can extend our way of thinking, how we think, is by staying in a real tauira role. And that becomes more difficult in the society where I'm a specialist doctor, and if you're in distress, or more, I think it hits the heart more if you think about your 12-year-old daughter is in distress, or your 5-year-old, if you knew that your 5-year-old was cutting because they were upset psychologically, or your young daughter's in an abusive relationship and she's only 14. That hits home hard, and so you want to go to the expert.
And those are realities,
Those are realities. So you want to go to an expert. And so sitting as a tauira with family who want your expertise, you have to really think about how to be a student. because they're wanting the expert. And if I was to make a quick leap into a Tangaroa realm, there's a pūrākau where tāwhiri is so distraught by the notion that the siblings want to separate the parents, rangi and papa. And in the storms that erupted, Tangaroa's children died. Ikaroa's children. And some of their carcasses were laying on the shores, and Tangaroa screamed out to tūmātaunga for help. And tūmātaunga said in Māori, there are your resources in front of you. And I think, yeah, that's so cool, because that's what we want to say to whānau. You are your best resource. But if I was to say that to you when you're distressed and have come to me as an expert, it's about timing, it's about how you say it, it's about holding space, listening deeply, and finding that moment. It's like playing a game of league, knowing when to throw the ball. Don't take your eyes off the ball because you could miss a moment. And those moments happen where whānau not only don't feel like they have resources, but they don't feel like you're the right resource, and yet you might be their only chance. And so they tolerate these micro fractures where the expert gets it wrong or says things wrong or it didn't align well. And so that's that's that tauiratanga for Mahi Atua. But the most challenging one is about hongi te whaiwhaya, our mātātua whakatauki that talks about inhaling, embracing that's foreign to you, inhaling the enemy. And that does go back to that confidence and way of thinking again, because we're our worst enemy. And so that's Mahi Atua, and that's the kaupapa that we are promoting across the motu.
Being a student and being in a space of, even though you may have the puno of answers, you may have everything that someone needs, but how do you facilitate a space that can create a level of safety where walls come down so they may see the answers within themselves? Or because would that be, because there's a big term around at the moment, holding space. It's someone might come to you for some kind of a listening ear, they might come for advice, they might want to come and just share. And big part of holding space, to my understanding, is more so listening than giving. And how are we able to sustain that frequency or sustain that space to provide the healing or the growth for people coming in? And it's not even just happening once, it could be over a period of time there. What comes to mind for you around holding space for?
I'll tell you what comes to mind is carving. And carving thinking patterns. And when you're in pūrākau, as often as I am, every sentence you talk about is a pūrākau, is pinging in my head. So holding space reminds me of Huru Te Ārangi, who, when Tāne was trying to separate the parents and failed and persevered, Tāne got to a point where some of the siblings had cut the sinews and the bloodshed and the kura waka, which would become the fertile soil for Hine Ahu One to be formed. And Tāne was like, yay, the sinews are cut, I can do this now, but rangi was really heavy. And so Tāne knew that Tāne needed something from the very atua tāwhiri mātia that was hating on Tāne. So cleverly enough, they bypassed and went to another relation who was Huru Te Ārangi. And Huru Te Ārangi gifted her 4 children. And they were Tokohuru Māwake, Tokohuru Nuku, Tokohuru Rangi, and Tokohuru Ātia, 2 female and 2 male versions of Huru Te Ārangi's children. And they would become the 4 winds. And they were deliberately positioned as pou to keep rangi and papa apart, and that's holding space. And that's gifted, that they were gifts. That was our first whāngai story. And so a mother giving her children for a bigger kaupapa. You know, can you imagine what that does to mums who haven't been in a good space and so gave their children to friends or wider family? The connection that they would feel to this story, and also the importance of children in creating space. But you know, we talk about holding space, but this is the story.
Yeah.
An important point in the story is that it did not bring about an answer. It brought about more problems. And so creating more space just meant that they had space, and there wasn't space before. It was dark, and now they had space, but it was still dark, and now it was wet as well. So from one problem to many problems is what holding space is about. And when we go back to Mahi Atua's first principle was she's tēnei te pō, no mai te ao. I can't remember his name, but it was a recent Indigenous conference online. Oh, I wish I could remember his name. And he put up a slide about primal behaviour or primal way of being, and a way of being that fell under the category of modernity. And he referred to going back to primal. He didn't want to say Indigenous because he didn't want to get caught up in modernity discourse. I love it when people trip over their words and are careful. And so he said primal to remove that. And he talked about sitting in the uncertainty, sitting in the unknown. We are but a grain of sand that makes up the wider universe. And for us to feel like we have to have certainty and know how tomorrow's going to land is all part of modernity.
Wow.
And so as Indigenous people, we need to, you know, if something's happening that's distressing, we hold space to sit in the distress together, not to remove the distress, not to find a solution. And we have to be careful about Western psychology, which is stay positive, which is solution-focused. But you follow the blueprints of our pūrākau, it's like stay collective, be determined. If you want to be like Tāne, fail, 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 and persevere, which is blinking hard. Yeah.
Wow.
Holding space. That's where my mind went.
What comes to my mind when you're sharing that is when you do have space to either share or open up, what you might get isn't what you thought it was. And so you realize that the issue that you're coming with isn't actually the issue. Because the issue suggests that it's external. When the actual deeper problem, in my experience anyway, is that, oh, maybe it's not that thing that's out there, and maybe it's right here. And that's what comes to mind when you say one problem turns to many in the context that we're speaking. And how does one start to create new pathways psychologically to give them that space of toe? Because when we talk about also your first principle, it's not like you're already preparing people that you're going to go into te pō. It's not o te ao. It's not te ao marama, which is, I guess, how you're saying that framework, that just think positive. But now there's a preparation that, no, we're going to go deep and then we're going to come out.
I start from the beginning. The first story in ngā pūrākau orokohanga is Noho Tatapu, where the first sibling of the children of Rangi and Papa was Ikaroa, and Ikaroa had had enough of the restriction I Noho Tatapu ngā Atua, and shared the problem with Toro I Waho, who was a nearby sibling. And Toro I Waho's role was to catch the words and share them with the wānanga, with the rest of the siblings. And that's what happens. That's what's needed. Share the problem. Speak the problem, and it requires someone to listen to the problem, not listen to the interpretation of the problem or what they think the problem is. It's a word catcher. You're catching the words, and it's really easy for us, because of our stories that have unfolded from colonization, as well as our disconnection from our own whakapapa and the stories, the beautiful stories in them. What's likely to happen is that you come with these judgments and discriminatory ideas, and almost an assumption of how you're meant to be, and they get in the way. So you start there, and you're right when you pointed inward about yourself, because if we do want an element of control, the only thing that we can control is our thinking, how we're thinking, being able to shift from what we're thinking, which is very content-laden. We have hui about content agendas. I don't like hui with agendas. I like us to talk and always be able to critique how we're being with each other in that space, and that's where you start. You learn to speak up. We've as you know, when we think about oppression, it's about silencing a voice and silencing curiosity. And this story, Noho Tatapu, talks about Uepoto, who's the Atua who saw the Hinatore, which was the first variant of light. And Uepoto and two other siblings, Te Mamaru and Peketua, as a collective went toward that light regardless of the makutu that whirua would inflict on them. The desire, the curiosity was too strong, and so they kept forging regardless of the hits of the attacks. And that curiosity is the first thing that needs to be removed if you want to oppress a people. And so being able to find our curiosity, to be able to think, like when you have a perspective that I want to just become whirua and disagree with you, absolutely not. And in my certainty, I lose space to understand more about what you're talking about.
Wow. Man, you weren't lying when you see things in pūrākau ne. It's like kōrero, just like as you said though, there's a lot of what we think and a lot of what we do. These references that have been there since the beginning of time. And so was there a moment for you where you read one pūrākau or you heard something and you're like, whoa, I need to find out more about this?
Well, actually, the orokohanga o Mahi Atua, te whakaaro, I puta mai I tētahi wānanga I au e ako ana te reo, and nā he mi te pēti, ngānei whakaako mai a mātou, ngā āhuatanga o te rākau, o te taiaha. And he, I don't know what the move was, he said, we're like this. And said in Māori, I think this is what he said anyway. He said, he goes, that this was the movement of the albatross. And I don't know, but it was something, because I'd already been a nurse for 2 years in Māori mental health, was using Māori approaches, and we'd arrived in our reo class to a wahanga where we had to whakamārama I ngā pūrākau I te reo. So I couldn't whakapākiatia. If I saw a word, we'd have to think about how to understand it in Māori. So that was going on too. And when he did that movement, I thought, so we behave like our Atua. That was the beginning. I went, man, I felt like I was levitating. And if I'm levitating, imagine what the whānau in distress would be like if they could see their behaviours outside of judging them, outside of an illness. That's trippy. that's yeah. So that was a beginning. And honestly, my humble beginnings in really deepening my understanding in pūrākau was right back to 7. You know, you can name the famous 7 Atua. And I started there. And there were so many stories that I got wrong. And I think, how many whānau did I tell that story to? That's where you get versions, eh? I think, I almost feel like contacting them now and say,
Actually, disregard everything.
Like,
here's the proper one.
Honestly, I had this story about Uru, and I didn't know that Uru was the older sibling, and it was such a lovely story. I told it. Uru had 3 baskets, and the tears flew into, dropped into the beautiful 3 baskets, and then one had the moon, and one had the sun, and one had it was all like the way that Mark tells it's quite way more detailed. And I didn't know that. Which I think is that Tāne story, fail and persevere. But yeah, there's lots of times where I've wanted to know more about pūrākau, and then there's lots of times when I think, nah, that's too hard. Can I have the kindergarten version, please? My brain's it just can't get its head around it. So yeah, those were my beginnings. You start where you start. I do think that when you read The Pedagogy of the Oppressed by Paulo Freire, and I know it freaks people out because it's quite a heavy read. In fact, our team, Te Kurahuna, we sometimes have reading sessions with The Pedagogy of the Oppressed, and the first 3 minutes I ask our team to experience their own whare wānanga as I'm reading. Like, don't focus on what I'm reading, focus on what's happening to them as I'm reading. And it's great because once you get your honesty out, like, these big words pissed me off or shut me down, or why can't they just say it, speak English, or, oh no, too many words, I just shut up. And we all just laugh and then remind ourselves that that we can learn this, and let's give it another go. And second time round, we stay in process, and they'll go, oh yeah, that was way better. And then they get the lessons. And one of the lessons in there that we often talk about in our wānanga is the banking of knowledge. And the banking of knowledge almost implies that if I tell you everything I know, then you too will have that connection, will be great, you'll be successful. And it's not, when you look at tāne te wānanga, it's not just about retrieving the baskets and the mauri stones. The knowledge came from the journey itself.
The journey. It's like the journey, but also in the sharing.
Yeah, the experience.
The experience.
And experience is nothing without relationship and connections. Good ones and bad ones.
I kōrero mai koe e pāna ki tō huarahi te reo Māori, te ako I te reo Māori. I whai huarahi koe ki te ako ihia, and e hea tō pakeke?
When I was a little girl, my dad, matatau e te reo. But he, like many Māori, migrated from Tikitiki to Wellington to get a trade. And so the only places he spoke Māori was in the pub to his other Ngāti friends. And they would get drunk, and the pub closed at 10 o'clock, and they'd come home to our house. And then I'd come down in my jammers and, really blonde hair with 4 eyes. And he just loved that dark skin, my dad. And he just loved that he had this little white girl that he could say, ko waito ingo, and I would say, ko Diana aho. That was my reo. That's as far as it went. I'm almost pissed off and, happy about that memory at the same time. And so he passed in 2016, my dad. But I would hear him speaking Māori to his friends, and I would hear him get angry to the weather person on TV for saying Taupo and Rotorua. And so that was the beginning, I think, of my real journey, that my dad had something that I yearned for. But my lesson was actually in the Reo Rangatahi book, following, or while I was hapu with my first child, Harvey, and I was 17, and I wanted to speak Māori to this baby. So I went to Reo Rangatahi. I was reading it by myself, But it wasn't until I was a nurse in Reo Polytech, had some courses, and most of my teachers have been from Tūhoi, and so both from Reo Polytech and then Te Wānanga o Aotearoa. And then I did a full course and part-time courses. I did something at Massey University. But none of them brought me into the space like I feel like since moving to the Tairāwhiti and having reo everywhere. And
I Māori hake te wā wai.
Yeah, I think so. But even though I had all of this knowledge, it became about the confidence and the ability to accept that I'm going to make mistakes and don't, try it and make mistakes rather than, not make any mistakes and never speak Māori. And I don't know, I think in the last couple of years that it's picked up a little bit more and I've become more confident.
Tāhua. And so we're talking about Matariki and no te Tairāwhiti koe. And ko tō whetū, ko Waitā. Kei koe ētahi kōrero, ētahi pūrākau e pāna ki te moana, e pāna ki a Matariki, o e pāna ki a Waitā a hake rānei. What comes to mind, or what are some kōrero that you've either heard or grown up with when it comes to Matariki or Waitā, kōrero around the moana?
He tauira tēnei, he whepi, kei te kōhanga tōnu tēnei wahine, e pāna ki ngā mātaurangi, e pāna ki Matariki. And so...
Ko hau o ki tērā.
But in wānanga and, with Rangi and him coming over the coast and his YouTube clips and wonderful wānanga that we just had with the kōrero taiao,
ne.
I toko maru, and going through the karakia and, to whakawete ngā kupu me ngā tikanga o ia kupu me te hohonutanga me ngā pūrākau I roto I te karakia. And so it was helpful. It almost consolidated our whakaaro and mahi atua. And when I was thinking about Waitā, I really thought about Tangaroa. And that made me think about our Māori wahine, because there's this huge here to ako, our anything about our Atua wahine. And so, I think about Hine Moana, and I know that Hine Moana married Kiwa, and I know that they're all part of Waitā. And then I have this wānanga every now and then with my husband, and he says, well, your sweat is Waitā. And so this is me hypothesizing, right? Theorizing as a Māori woman, trying to reinstate the possibility that me as a Māori woman and my thoughts about reimagining what it might be if I link my ideas that I have with the little bit of knowledge that I've given, what might come. And so for me, I just go back to the pūrākau that I know. And I know that when we see Waitā, that they're tohu, right? They're tohu to let us know certain things. And I'm yet to sort of plug all of those thoughts together. And I quite like that, having random thoughts that have no connection yet, which means that you're still holding space in the problem. It keeps me curious, wanting to know. There's a couple of Tangaroa stories that I thought I might share.
Cool.
When I talked about noho tatapu, and in that, it was Tāne that came up to Whiro and said to Whiro, I can see that you're fearful of what Uepoto te Māmaru and Peketua are doing going toward the light. Fearful because, you're used to status quo. But I think that we should listen to Tāne. And, I think that we should, follow, that we should consider this light. And that was the first battle. And it was Tangaroa that said to Tāwhiri, actually, I think we should listen to Tāne. A storm erupted. And there were two houses, Tū Te Aniwaniwa and Huaki Pauri. Tū Te Aniwaniwa was the older siblings, and Huaki Pauri was the younger siblings with these new ideas about a new way of being. And Tangaroa was in Tū Te Aniwaniwa. Tangaroa is one of the oldest 10 siblings. And Tangaroa was saying to Tāwhiri, this is a battle between the two, that I think that we should listen to our younger sibling. And it's just ideas. And Tāwhiri took that as an insult to their tikanga.
Uh-huh.
And Tangaroa said, well, actually, I think that I just wanted us to listen to that idea rather than what you think this means for you.
Mm.
And it was Tāwhiri that said, actually, I think you're saying that you'd rather be in Huaki Pauri. And Tangaroa shifted to Huaki Pauri.
Wow.
And shifted from this old way of being, this old way of thinking, this old way of knowing. And Tangaroa, with all Tangaroa's mass, had a mandate. And I'm not sure that Tāne would have eventually been listened to had it not been for Tangaroa. And so when we're thinking about pure, and we're thinking about the Tangaroa phase of the maramataka, and the other phases like mātohi, different times in the maramataka cycle that are good for pure at the moana, it makes me think about, and I know we're not talking about pūtakawa, but when we are thinking about death, that we're thinking about a mihi to the part of you that's no longer, and you know, it sounds a bit cliche, but no longer serves you. The way I like to think of it is because it wasn't just Tāwhiri that was loyal to these old ways. Te Ihorangi Atua of the rain was also loyal to this way where Whiro was the leader. And so the storm involved the rain and the winds. And I often think about Te Ihorangi's loyalty to these old ways of being. And if we could employ the wind and the rain to think about supporting a new way that would eventually become your status quo. And so a pure at the sea, what I love about Tangaroa, Hine Moana, Kiwa, is that there's this repurposing of energy, that the sea can repurpose this negative energy and turn it into something positive. I really like that story about Tangaroa, thinking about Waitā. Not quite sure of the connection, and maybe Rangi can tell us. So not quite sure of the connection. When we see Waitā, is that an even better time to pure? You know, there's lots of things I don't know.
Curiosity there.
Yeah, absolutely. But there's stories that I have thinking about Tangaroa and thinking about Tangaroa's role in my life. Yeah, Hine Moana's role. I don't really see them as genders. I'm a bit scared to see them with gender because of our human instinct.
Is it more around the feminine, masculine, or is that even categorizing it a gender or nah?
I think that we get stuck on that. I think that's the issue that our rainbow community have, is that gender is a social construct. And it's possible that you can be born with a penis and be wahine in your soul, you know, and that's how you want to depict yourself and express yourself in your world. But not everyone knows that. So when we're talking about atua wahine, atua tāne, or ira wahine, ira tāne, I relate to that, ira wahine, ira tāne, but to say an atua is wahine or tāne takes me into thinking, but don't we have an ira wahine, ira tāne side? So how come we're saying that the atua are just one? Yeah, just lots of curiosity.
Wow.
No knowing.
And in your line of mahi, you know, being a doctor, Māori, psychiatrists, and we look at, I guess, where we have been in terms of our oranga as a people, we're winning in the wrong things, Suicide comes to mind, poverty comes to mind, domestic violence comes to mind. And those have been put out there and they are spoken about. In your line of mahi, how is that still happening? Or what are some things that you feel would be helpful for our whānau, even for us to be aware of when it comes to these kinds of challenges that we experience as a people?
First of all, are you asking about if domestic violence and all those things are still happening?
Yeah, is it happening? Is it still going down that same trajectory?
Yeah, violence is happening. Violence has always happened, right? I consider what Tāne did to Uepoto, Te Mamaru and Peketua was violent as well. Power issues, issues that stem from fear and we interpret them in different ways. The biggest violence that I see perpetrated in our spaces is racism and systemic societal racism. It's quite violent. And
I've heard you say you're unforgiving about challenging that too.
Yeah. Have you?
Yes.
I remember when I came to the Tairawhiti, and at the time I was the head of department for psychiatry within the DHB, the Gisborne Hospital. And a wahine psychiatrist came over to experience, to help out. And, one of my first kōrero I gave to her was about the service that we were developing, Te Kūwatawata, and that it was not just founded on indigenising the space we occupy, but it had to address institutional racism. And she looked at me like what do you mean? So I let her know. And it wasn't until she had to leave a year later because of her family situation that she said in one of her farewells to me that, when you told me that, it felt like you were leaning over and punching me in the face. I had to go home and have a red wine. And when we look at racism, it's a social determinant of well-being.
Wow.
So the fact that health professionals don't know that means that it's not a conversation that they're having, that they're open to having, which means that the people in distress coming into their care also will have an experience that's disconnected from the whakapapa of racism and how the legacy of the doctrine of Christian discovery is impacting that relationship in that space. And so, I am unforgiving about anyone that wants to challenge it with ridiculous notions of reverse racism, or the notion that it doesn't exist, or even the naivety or ignorance, whatever the word is, it isn't right. So if you don't want to use the word, that's one thing, but you can't deny that it's happening.
You can't be afraid of that if you're...
Yeah. But you said, you asked about what can we do? I stepped out of the system. I still work in primary mental health, but I stepped out of the secondary service system, deliberately trying to scale up this thing called Te Kūwatawata. And we've developed about 8 services. And what we know is that in the spaces that we've developed, there's still this real difficulty for the organisation or the service to acknowledge the systemic factors and the practitioner factors that contribute to unequal treatment.
Wow.
We're always looking at the population factors like the person and
Yeah.
they're not coming to appointments because they live in the country or their boss won't give them time off. So we're trying to be real aroha about it, but we're not looking at us.
Wow.
And we, individuals in the system, make up the system. So when, we were talking about us changing ourselves, change starts with ourselves, that happens in an institutionally racist system as well. Change has to come from us. And if we are denying this thing called racism, and if we are saying, I do good by my people, my patients, my whānau I work with, they would let me know if I'm not, then straight away you've shut the door on curiosity. And wouldn't you rather know if something you did upset the whānau you're serving? And wouldn't it be terrible to think that they didn't tell you because they thought you were too weak to cope with the feedback, and then you carried on doing it for another 10 years? So in terms of what we can do to help our whānau, who should be bloody distressed in this racist world we live in, right? That's what our hikoi was about yesterday.
That's right.
Toi tū te tiriti, that's what it was about, standing in our power. And we need to stand in our power and speak up like ke kerewai. But darned, I think, if the government's going to listen like toro I waho. But we do need to stand up and speak and listen to each other. And whilst we're wanting to stand up and protest, it's really important that we understand that colonisation and racism has impacted how we relate with each other. And with ourselves. And so we have to start there. We have to start there. And, to indigenize the space we occupy means to speak up when I have a problem in this relationship with you. That's as indigenous as you can get. To whakamana the hononga with the people that you care most about. And if they don't want to change, then you have to think about yourself and what you can do to pivot.
So that is a common thing there, is the knowing that there's challenges within a relationship, and sometimes you just feel like there's the desire to change, but there's an unwillingness to work together to create the sense of change required. And so then that often falls back on an individual to either take accountability and change their ways. So again, we're sort of wrapping around back to the having confidence. We're wrapping around to the journey within. And I think it's, again, a lot of the pūrākau that you've been sharing suggests that there are resources and that there are pathways out there to support our well-being, to be in a state of flourishing relationships, being in a state of ora. But coming back to your first principle, sometimes you got to go into te pō to come into te ao.
Well, I was just thinking about our waitā kōrero, and Dale Takitimu talked to me about trying to align the food that she, and you're like this, the food that you eat when you're wanting to align with a particular atua characteristics. And I guess stepping into te pō requires us to step into it, blood, sweat and tears. And when you think about the sweat, it's like, do we need to eat more blimmin' kina? Or more, more salty foods.
Wow.
Be able to, he whakaaro nui, or I don't know. Maybe we should do a research and apply to the Marsden Fund and research the idea. Because we're looking at salty food for gout. Maybe we should have a waitā investigation of eating seafood, which makes you connect to the moana more, having a more purposeful way of being, brings out the best version of yourself, which makes you more willing to pivot or shift from tūtea niwa thoughts to huaki pauri thoughts, pērā i a Tangaroa.
Wow, I like that whakaaro.
Do you?
Might be worthwhile entertaining. Before we wrap up, there's another kōrero that I wanted to get your thoughts on too, because as I've been working on myself for a little while, it's a journey that I've found a lot of rotten seeds, but also seeds that I could intentionally plant. And it's been a beautiful journey. Really enjoyed every part of it. one thing that I have noticed as well is that te huarahi ki te tinihia tō oranga, the path to changing yourself requires a level of discomfort. And when we move into discomfort, the emotional response or the reaction is to resist it and go back to what is comfortable. And I've heard a lot of kōrero through conversations with friends, through even people that I support, that even if the space is good, if it's unfamiliar, it could be seen as uncomfortable. And so people would rather, without knowing, be where they are, even if it's destructive, even if it's in a state of te pō, because it's comfortable, rather than being in a state of ora. We might want that, but how do we familiarize ourselves to make those changes so that we don't return back to spaces that we're trying to change or grow out of? Is there any kōrero in that aligns or that makes sense? Or
Yeah, there's heaps. I think if I overanalyze what your question is how can we travel the straight line? You can't. That's
short
my
answer.
Short answer. But if I was to link to Tangaroa again, Tangaroa had a human line, and the human line went from Tangaroa to Pautu, to Rua te Pupuke, to Manuruhi. So if you think about that, Tangaroa to human line. So when humans came about, we needed tikanga, we needed order. Because in order for the humans to survive, they would need to eat from the fish of their kind, their whānau, right? Their tuakana. So they had te whatukura a Tangaroa, the magic hook, fishing hook. And that was new. It was a new concept. Rua te pupuke, when Rua went fishing, would use the magic hook, bring up the first catch, give it back. That acknowledgement that I'm giving back to my tuakana so that I'm doing this to survive, to keep this line alive. And I also know that you are of me. It's quite special.
Yeah.
So already I'm thinking there's something in that for you. You're creating new ways, but what are you giving back to your old ways? The second part is that Rua te Pupuke's child, I won't go into psychotherapy about your inner child, we won't do that, but the Rua te Pupuke's child, Manuruhi, went fishing with the hook without the tikanga. No throwing the fish back. And when Tangaroa found out, Manuruhi was petrified into stone and dragged under the sea and placed on the wharenui as the tiko, which would become the manaia. Ngāti Porou story, by the way. The meeting house, the cave, was known as Hau te Ananui or Hui te Ananui, and there Rua te Pupuke found his son and grieved. And, you could have all sorts of thoughts about, I didn't teach my children the right way, but this was new tikanga. If you're thinking about your great-great-great-grandchildren, then guaranteed the effort that you put in now will have a difference then.
Yeah.
If you're thinking like an individual, which is very Western, that whole individual me and my change, you might not see some of it in your lifetime. But there are many ways that you can narrate your backward and forward and your sideways and the failings and the attempts to do right and do better. And the failings, your failings, will become Atua Pūrakau, just like our Atua Pūrakau are for us now, the trippy.
Wow.
There's lots of stuff they did that I don't know that I'd agree with, but they help me understand me, just like your descendants will understand you through not just the good things, the material things that you offer, but all of your story, all of it. even what you call the rotten seeds. Speaking of rotten seeds, Rongo, when Rongo came out from Te Puke a Tāne, was trying to find their way out, decided didn't want to stay hidden. And every time the storm would erupt again, go back into hiding because Rongo would get lost in the ngahere, couldn't find their way out. And although that might be seen as a failing, everywhere that Rongo touched became the whakapapa of different types of rongoā.
So every time he would go back in, that was the
I don't know.
seedling
Yeah, I would
rongoā.
reframe on the rotten seeds and write poetry about that story that you're talking about. And it is so much more than you can imagine, really.
Well, thank you for that beautiful koha.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any final words that you would like to share with our whānau? You've taken us on a beautiful journey, and I just want to give it over to you.
Oh, any final words? I don't think I know how to make final comments. I think when we're thinking about healing, I truly believe that remembering the stories of old, our Atua stories and my past stories, our past stories, the ones that are a little bit embarrassing or shameful, we might not ever share them with anyone, but our story and our Atua story can help us really understand in the now how to navigate our future. And my story, if I don't share it, will always only be from the perspective of me, which might call it rotten. But someone else might say, that's actually beautiful and thank you because I'm holding the same story and I've been too ashamed thinking it was all about me. And so that's, I think that our pūrākau collectively from our Atua, that part of the Wairua down to us, we've got a bright future. We've got a bright future when we do that.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much. E mihi ka tika ki a koe. What comes to mind, I heard a kōrero from Dr. Ihi Heke, and we were talking about stories. And he said, when you look on a pepehao, you look at whakapapa, you see names. And then he brought our focus to the line that connects the name. And he said, it's in that you see the story. It's there that you actually bring meaning to what that name represents. And so I think it aligns to the kōrero that we have been sharing. And so thank you for all of the pūrākau. Thank you for the healing that you have probably provided for people who have listened, but also for the mahi that you've been championing and creating an alternative way that should be the way for our people to better understand their state of mind, more importantly, their entire well-being. And so just want to again give you a big mihi and heaps of aroha mō tō huarahi that hasn't finished. But just want to thank you for gracing us, our kōrero as well. And kia koutou katoa, thank you so much for listening. Tēnā tātou.